There are more people in the country, more immigrants, more workers than we expected, but output growth has still been incredibly weak, so the output per worker and per hour they're working, as measured, has fallen as a result.
When militant opponents of nuclear energy talk about safety risks, I think that is often a rationalization. So it's really emotionally uncomfortable.
They've cut the growth forecast by half to 0.75%, but said that could get worse if the trade war kicks off or escalates further. Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here at the IEA, and as always, I'm joined by Tom Clougherty, our Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director. This podcast tries to get under the bonnet of the week's news and into the issues that matter to free marketeers and classical liberals. This week, we've got good news, we think, on nuclear energy from the UK government, less good news from the Bank of England. But to start, interesting news and slightly concerning news from across the pond, as Donald Trump has kicked off his tariff war, declaring and then reneging perhaps on tariffs to Canada and Mexico and on China too. Kristian, what's happening and why should we be worried?
Well, what's happening is something that's at the same time extremely unsurprising and somewhat surprising. So it's unsurprising because if there is such a thing as Trumponomics, then this kind of aggressive, retaliatory protectionism, that is it. So there are videos of him from the 1980s already, when he was first getting into political commentary in the broadest sense, where he was talking about foreign countries ripping off the United States. And in those days, Japan was his main villain, but the rhetoric has been pretty much the same throughout the decades. It's just now he has different villains. And what's also been a constant is that, well, back then, it was never quite clear what exactly he was objecting to. So what exactly were the Japanese doing that he didn't like, other than the fact that the US had a trade deficit with them? He just had this idea that if America imports more from another country than it exports to them, then that country is somehow ripping you off. They're up to no good. They're doing something devious. So the protectionism has been there all along. Slightly surprising, perhaps, that during his first term, he didn't really do much on that front, or at least not compared relative to other presidents. It was not exceptional. And now he's going full steam ahead. So he started with a 10% tariff rate on most Chinese imports, threatened a 25% tariff rate on Canadian and Mexican imports. And that's now been paused, but it's going to come into force unless he cancels it at the last minute. And he's also quite clearly hinted at a tariff of that sort being imposed on European imports. And well, what he's trying to achieve with this is slightly contradictory. So one of his slogans during the election campaign was that a tariff is a tax on a foreign country. So you can basically free ride. You can have other countries paying your tax revenue for you, and you don't need to tax your domestic population. So basically the thing that he's accusing everyone else of trying to rip him off, that's what he's trying to do now in reverse. And the other argument is, of course, that this is the way to make America great again. That slogan applied to economics. That's the way to revitalize domestic industries. Now, you can't have both of those at the same time. I'd argue neither, but say in principle, if it were possible to somehow impose tariffs in such a way that only the foreign company pays for it. So let's say you have an importer, they have big profit margins, and you slap a tariff on them, it's in principle imaginable that they will just accept it, lower their profit margins, keep their prices as they are. So to that extent, I guess you could sort of call it a tax on a foreign country. But then if that's what happens, then of course you're not promoting domestic industry, because then from the consumer's perspective, nothing has changed, right? That just means, okay, the foreign import hasn't become any more expensive. It's just that the company making it, they're making less profit now, but that's not something that you see in the supermarket. So you have no incentive to switch to a domestically produced good if that's what happens. But that we know from experience goes, the empirical evidence shows us from the first round Trump tariff and plenty of other examples, that is not what happens because most importers don't have those kinds of profit margins. It's a competitive market, and therefore, like most other taxes, it's just going to get passed on to consumers. So you're really taxing domestic consumers. And yes, you are probably promoting some domestic industries simply because they will now be domestically produced goods are now relatively more attractive. Their prices stay the same. The foreign imports get more expensive. So you substitute the domestically produced good for the foreign import in some sectors. But at the same time, of course, that means that consumers are poorer. And when consumers are poorer, they have to cut back somewhere else. There's something that you were previously able to afford that you can now no longer afford. And that is almost certainly going to hit some other domestic industry. So therefore, that just means you can't tariff yourself rich. You can't tariff yourself into prosperity. It could be that, say, if you apply it to cars or whatever, yes, maybe then some consumers will buy an American-made car rather than a European one or whatever they're applying it to. But then if that consumer is now poorer, they will maybe spend less on dining out. They will maybe cancel their gym membership. They will cut back on some discretionary spending, the domestic tourism, whatever. And then some other industry is going to suffer. So it should be just purely from a theoretical perspective before we look at any numbers. It should just be completely crystal clear that you can't improve the nation's overall prosperity in that way. And empirically, that's also exactly what happens. That's why this is, I guess, from our perspective, such a boring topic because there's really agreement. So every time there are surveys among some professional association of economists, it always shows if you ask them, do you think tariffs are bad? More than 90% say yes, and maybe you get a few who say, I don't know, haven't looked at it, and one or two contrarians, but there's basically no, it's as close to unanimity as you're going to get in economics. Is one of the issues that are really well understood. But yeah, the reason why we should be worried, to go back to that, is, it doesn't look as if there's going to be a UK-specific tariff for now. But that doesn't mean that we're off the hook because, if this is making America poorer, if this is making Canada, Mexico, Europe poorer, that's going to affect us as well. The EU is still the main, if we think of it as a single economic unit, is the biggest trading partner for Britain. And something that hits them is something that hurts them is going to hurt us. To a lesser extent, you could say the same about Mexico and Canada. And it rolls back the international division of labor. That's going to be the main long-term effect of any form of protectionism. You end up with an international division of labor that is less specialized, less fine-grained. You tie up resources, you tie up capital and labor power in sectors where they just should not be. You get economies making things that they should not be making. And that is, in the long run, going to be the main cost of tariffs. And that is a bigger deal than trying to work out whether this product or that product is now going to cost $10 more, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it's straightforward bad economics, or in a way it's worse than bad economics. It's just non-economic thinking, the kind of Trumpian tariff approach. And you're right. I mean, I think he believes this stuff genuinely. It goes back a long way. It is sort of the defining characteristic maybe of his particular brand of economic policy. On many domestic policy issues, he's a pretty classic Reagan Republican in terms of deregulation, in terms of tax cuts. The presentation and the rhetoric may be different, but certainly if you look at the first term, a lot of what he actually did on domestic economic policy was entirely in keeping with American Republican tradition. And actually, yes, there was a lot of bluster about trade, and tariffs did go up, but they went up modestly, and they continue to go up modestly under Joe Biden. it does look like potentially you're going to see a step change in tariffs. And I think the particular danger is if you set off a sort of tariff war where every country retaliates against the other one, international trade flows seize up, as Kristian says, you stop getting the degree of specialization, people don't exploit their comparative advantages enough, domestic markets become less competitive and therefore less productive. We all get poorer in the long run. And I mean, I guess there's a crucial point in there about should you retaliate if a country imposes a tariff on your exports? I mean, I would say emphatically, no, you shouldn't. If they want to hurt their domestic consumers, fine, that's bad. Let them do it. Don't punish your own domestic consumers as well. And by the way, it isn't just end consumers who consume imports. A lot of businesses import things as intermediate goods as well, including manufacturers. And this is one of the classic things. I think it was when George W. Bush, put tariffs on steel being imported into the US. Yes, the domestic steel industry did a little bit better, but overall, American industry did much worse because they were being forced to pay higher prices for steel in construction, in all sorts of different forms of manufacturing and so on. And so this is just a lose-lose. And, yes, if you're a big economic bloc, maybe if you're the US, maybe if you're China, maybe even if you're the EU, you can entertain ideas of putting up a protectionist wall and retaliating and treating this as kind of a geopolitical issue rather than an economic one. I think if you're Britain, you're in a very different situation. And I would say this is a good thing. It points us in the right direction. But your only real sensible approach here is just to unilaterally be as free trade as you possibly can, whatever the circumstances. That is the only thing that is going to be good or relatively good for the domestic economy. And I mean, it's one of those funny ones, isn't it, Kristian, that you say this is kind of a boring topic because there is so much consensus among economists. And I think because the proof is in the pudding, over decades, hundreds of years, free trade has proved how powerful it is as a force for improving living standards and driving economic development and everything else. And yet somehow, for a lot of people, it just doesn't sit right. Instinctively, there's something weird about international trade to them. And I suppose what's most peculiar here is, I come from Suffolk. I don't think anyone, even in Ipswich, is going to say, well, we're not going to buy goods from Norwich. How could I possibly have a trade surplus or a trade deficit with Norfolk? That would be horrendous. They're ripping us off. By selling us their turkeys or their ducks or whatever. And literally no one thinks that. No one thinks that probably about other places in England. I doubt anyone is really thinking that about Scotland or Wales or Ireland. Maybe some people start to get a little bit protectionist when it comes to France or the Low Countries or Germany or whatever. But there's this strange thing where somehow a transaction becomes less mutually beneficial the greater the distance it takes place over. And this makes no logical sense whatsoever. The great thing about trade is no one is exploiting anybody else. You're exchanging money for goods, and if I'm the buyer, I want the goods more than I want the money. If you're the seller, you want the money more than you want to retain the goods. We both benefit, we're both better off. In a way, this is basically the root of prosperity, by allowing mutually beneficial transactions to take place as much as possible. And so to say, well, I'm sorry, because you're from one country and you're from another, we're not going to have that. This is bad. It would be good if you were dealing with, someone of your own nationality within your own country's borders, but add the international thing and it's wrong. I mean, this is frankly just stupid, plain and simple. And yet it is one of those deeply persistent myths over time. And the good thing is we had a few decades where, in a way, maybe this was one of the nice things about the kind of managerial technocracy, that trade policy was just left to the experts to a certain extent. Domestic politics, democracy didn't get that involved for a while. And especially when you had those rounds of multilateral trade liberalization through the WTO, which of course ran out of steam, I guess, in the early 2000s probably. But it seemed like there was just sort of constant progress towards a freer trade world. Now, of course, this has become a more politically charged topic again. National democracies are getting more involved. Multilateral trade liberalization is completely sort of fallen by the wayside. Not many people are pursuing unilateral trade liberalization. So at best, you get bilateral deals, which can be good in their own terms, but also lead to an enormous amount of complexity. in terms of broader international trading agreements, or you might get regional blocks which are a little bit better. But the real danger, to go back to where we started, is that this turns into a sort of retaliatory trade war, and many of the benefits of globalization, which we've been reaping for many years, and which are real and which are substantial, whatever some naysayers may tell you, that will start to go into reverse. And that would be a very bad thing indeed, especially when we're already suffering for economic growth, especially when we have an aging population and some massive headwinds against us. Worst possible route to go.
Yeah, just one quick addition to this point about the psychological bias that's involved here. And yeah, you say nobody has a problem with the south of England importing from the north of England, and even trade with the neighbors is still kind of considered okay, even by people who are not classical liberals, not free marketeers. I read something about at the time when Donald Trump started with all this anti-trade rhetoric in the 80s. That was a time when in the US they had a moral panic around Japanese imports and foreign direct investment. And there was even, I think it was a novel set in a near future, so supposed to be dystopian, where all the American companies had Japanese names.
Blade Runner.
Yeah, could be that. I think it was several.
Yeah.
And that was a big moral panic at the time. And somebody wrote about this and the psychological dimension, and so essentially, yes, of course, there was a time when Japanese imports were rising fast, but Japan was never as important to the American economy as West Germany was, and they were kind of comfortable with that because West Germans looked like white Americans, so they had no particular bias against that. But the Japanese imports, that's what really triggered a moral panic, and it's irrational, but it's something that goes beyond economics, and that's maybe why we have a problem explaining this stuff.
I mean, you have to wonder what the Canadians have done, though, in that particular light. I mean, I suppose the one note to mention here is that I think the reason that the tariffs on Mexico and Canada have been suspended, or they've been delayed, the implementation of them, is because Trump is getting some deal on illegal immigration and some deal on kind of fentanyl being brought into America. So there is always a question of how much is this actually economics, how much is it really about trade, and how much is it just a bargaining chip, to put it politely, or just bullying of weaker neighbours, to put it in harsher terms.
It's a good example of politics getting in the way of good economics and frankly ruining things for everybody. Because they're clearly being used as a political tool by Trump. I mean, he's given a sort of a different array of reasons why tariffs are good. Some of them he tries to make the economic case, but actually it's really largely about being the strong man, which is then Trudeau. You see, when the 25% tariffs on Canada were threatened, Trudeau came out and said, look, we're going to do exactly the same thing, because he couldn't seem to have been, even though unilateral trade, just saying fine, but we're going to cut all of our tariffs in response, and would have been the right thing economically. On the world stage, it looks very different, but also it's working for Trump, and that in that sense, he's got what he wanted out of Canada. He's got what he wanted out of Mexico. There was the example of, I may get this one, but I think it was trying to deport some illegal migrants back to Cuba. Cuba said, we're not going to take them. Trump says, well, we're just going to put huge tariffs on you.
Colombia,
sorry, thank you.
Well, in his case, he believes in the economics of it, but he also uses it as a political as a way of throwing his weight about. So, and the geopolitics and the economics in his case, they just coincide.
Yeah. So a fairly depressing picture, which brings us on to our next topic, and the Bank of England's rate cut and growth forecast that they gave this week, into which tariffs and the global trade situation came into. They've cut the growth forecast by half to 0.75%, but said that could get worse if the trade war kicks off or escalates further. Tom.
Yeah, nice cheery topic to move on to. I think the first thing to say is that obviously this coincided with the Bank of England cutting interest rates, so they've taken 0.25% off the Bank of England base rate. I think probably my view on that is that it's a step in the right direction, but it's probably too little, too late. Having been much too lax on monetary policy during the pandemic, I think the Bank of England probably over-tightened in response, and have probably kept the stance of monetary policy too tight for too long, and the economy to a certain extent is suffering as a result. Of course, this is one of the dangers with trying to centrally plan anything. It's extremely difficult to calibrate your decisions correctly, and we're an awfully long way away from a more free market monetary system. But if we had one, and it's something the IEA has published on in the past, I suppose most notably, we did a recent collection end of 2023 on free banking, by Kevin Dowd, and we published other stuff along that theme in the old days. But if we work within the sort of conventional bounds of monetary policy as it's operated today, it does seem to me, yes, that interest rates have been too high for too long. They're probably still too high, although inflation is looking remarkably sticky at the moment. I think this latest forecast also has inflation staying up at, well, hitting 3.7% or something towards the end of this calendar year. So that, taken together with the downgrade in the growth forecast, a lot of people are saying stagflation, and I mean literally that does look true. We have inflation and we have a stagnant economy simultaneously. This is very bad news all round. I mean, I think maybe the most striking thing was just another layer down from those top level figures in what the Bank of England came out with, which is that productivity growth has really been appalling. It was thought to be bad already, and the latest revisions show that it's especially bad. So I think in the 4 quarters to the third quarter of 2024, productivity, so output per hour worked in the UK, was down almost 2.5%. Now, you would expect, or you would hope, that productivity output per hour growth would grow year on year, and that growth has been very weak. It's been sort of 0.5% to 1% a lot of the time since the financial crisis. People have kept thinking it'll get back up to its pre-crisis trend rate. No, but now in fact it looks like since the pandemic, during a period, by the way, when you would expect the economy to have really been bouncing back from all of the restrictions that we had during COVID-19. No, unfortunately, it looks like we've gone into reverse. We've sort of spluttered to a stop, and then we've started to go backwards. So this is really troubling. And one of the ways that it's been explained is they've said, actually, it turns out there are more people in the country, more immigrants, more workers than we expected, but output growth has still been incredibly weak. So the output per worker and per hour they're working, as measured, has fallen as a result. Now, and a lot of people will obviously seize on this and say, well, look, this shows immigration is dragging the economy down. And I think you can make that argument. And what I would say, maybe slightly counterintuitively, is if productivity has fallen simply because lots of low productivity immigrants have come into the country, okay, that's bad. But it's probably better than the alternative explanation, which is that something is really going wrong with the businesses and the domestic workers that we had here. Actually, I'm not sure, although we have probably brought in a lot of fairly low productivity workers on, like, say, health and social care visas and stuff over the last couple of years. It doesn't seem to me that, although there've been a lot of them, quite famously, it doesn't seem to me that that's enough to explain everything that's gone on with this fall in productivity, which then feeds through into the growth numbers and everything else. So I think, unfortunately, there are deeper causes. I mean, it may be that this revision later gets revised away and it's some sort of quirk in the statistics. You probably shouldn't read too much into one set of numbers, but I think it does underline something that we've talked about an awful lot, which is that Britain's economy is just not doing well at all and hasn't been doing well for a very long time, and that this should be the overriding priority for any politician enacting any policy. What can they do to turn this around? And just by the way, the other angle here is that we're about a month or so away from Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, standing up and giving her spring update on the public finances. If you look at the way that borrowing costs for government have increased since the budget last year, and then you look at the Bank of England halving its growth forecast, you'd imagine the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, would follow suit. Rachel Reeves only had 10 billion of headroom against her fiscal target or her fiscal rule at the budget. My guess is that's all gone. And so there are questions then about what does the government do? They've said they're committed to the fiscal rule. The fiscal rule is obviously you're hitting a rolling target 5 years away. So it doesn't necessarily require immediate action, as in spending cuts or tax increases. My guess is that they'll do what the Conservatives are always criticised for doing, which is pencil in some fairly unrealistic spending reductions for years 4 or 5 of the forecast, so they can just sneak under the rule. And then they will hope that the economy improves in the meantime, or maybe based on recent rhetoric and recent policy developments, they'll do more than just hope, and they will actually lean into this nascent deregulatory agenda, supply-side liberalization, trying to get growth going, and hope that the benefits of that will emerge fast enough that they won't actually have to go through with those spending cuts that they've penciled in when you get towards the end of the parliament. Listen, that's my guess, because I think they've been scared off further tax increases, at least for now. But honestly, you never know.
Well, I guess that will be the only positive spin on this. Of course, the figures look quite bleak, but we've often talked about on this podcast how the new, or now not so new anymore, Starmer government, how they often make the right noises on supply side reforms, but often in a way where we don't really believe them. We always think, well, maybe they mean it, but it is only skin deep. If they have some excuse not to do it, they will take it. If there was some other factor that gave us a short-term economic boost, they would then probably say, well, let's lean back now and let's not worry too much about the supply side reforms. We need a period where it does look bad, and we want them to get a bit desperate, because that's the only way in which they are going to think seriously about the supply side reforms and maybe put some of it even.
So you're taking a bit of an accelerationist view here, where
or at least I don't want
a great deal of ruin in the nation, as Adam Smith says.
Well, at least I don't want any distracting factors, anything that makes the figures look better in the short term than they really should be, given the underlying fundamentals.
Will the supply side stuff that they've talked about and that we've welcomed quite a lot, will the growth impacts of those things come on quick enough to get them out of this hole, or they're going to have to do something shorter term that would work, that would magic something up in the before that?
I mean, I think supply side reforms do take time, but frankly, so would pro-growth tax reform, for example. You wouldn't necessarily get an immediate boost to economic activity. I mean, I suppose you might, in a kind of Keynesian sense, of just sort of priming the pump or something. That tends to be something that we're not particularly in favor of around this table. I think any meaningful pro-growth reform, you're trying to improve the productive capacity of the economy. That's not something that happens overnight. It's not just a switch you can press. And maybe because of the inherent, almost insatiable short-termism of politicians, that's why they tend not to get around to these agendas, because they think, well, that would be great, but what does it do for me over the next 6 months? Or how does it help me deal with the headlines I'm facing right now? It's one of those classic things where the best time to do this was, 25 years ago. The second best time is right now. And I don't think there's any alternative to it, frankly. And I think probably government is realizing that, but it is going to be harder than many people kind of expect. And it does take time.
Yeah, but there are also different timescales, different time horizons in different areas of supply side reform. So if we got energy absolutely right, yes, of course, those are big capital intensive projects. There is no way in which we can immediately get a massive boost from that. But on things like what we talked about last time, the third runway at Heathrow, airport capacity, that's something where towards the end of the parliament we could see some effect, and where even a short-termist government, unless short-termist really just means literally the next year, could actually be propelled into action. And the same on the housing market. These are that's an area where you could just approve a lot of things, and we could quite quickly see something.
Yeah, I mean, even on energy, to be fair, yes. I mean, in terms of infrastructure development, that takes a long time. If the government simply elected to take a lot of the costs that they're imposing on energy bills off them, obviously that might have a fiscal cost in certain respects, but you would think that would probably give a kind of immediate boost as well. So yeah, I mean, there are things that will help in the short term, but I think there are probably things which are less palatable to government, and especially to a Labour government, because they might be about reversing some of the tax increases we saw at the budget last year. It might be about energy, ditching some of their environmental policies and so on.
Yeah, I was going to say there's an element where they may have to U-turn on a couple of things if they wanted to get those benefits, like the budget tax increases, like the employment rights bill that they may want to water down, which may have a good effect, although the unions would have something to say.
Well, that's the first thing. Stop digging.
Yes, exactly. Just first do no harm.
Yeah.
Yeah. although I don't think we'll hold our breath on those points. But as we've said, they are making the right noises and taking some positive steps on the supply side reform. This week, they've talked about nuclear energy and again we're going to say no to the blockers and the stoppers and the NIMBYs. But in this case in particular, to grow the supply of nuclear energy in the country, to make it easier to build small modular reactors and quicker, so that we can sort of increase the supply of energy, which is another inflationary cost and something that's harming growth. Tom, any views on how optimistic we can be about this?
Yeah, and I think it's certainly encouraging, because I think, again, I probably talked last week about, it's one thing to say government backs this project and we'll get it done, and when maybe when it's so difficult to do anything, having the centre of government just plough through the bureaucracy, that's good insofar as it goes, but actually you need systemic reform, you need deregulation, and it does seem like they're pursuing that when it comes to nuclear. They're recognizing that it's no accident that it takes about a decade longer to build a nuclear power station in the UK than it does, say, in South Korea. It's no accident that the cost of our nuclear energy is about 5 times in per megawatt hour terms what it would be in South Korea, and that most of the difference is down to the way we regulate. And part of it's planning, part of it's the regulation of nuclear itself, part of it, I guess, is to do with the whole energy market and the approach the government has taken to energy infrastructure development. So I think these are positive moves, and I think particularly, I won't pretend to be an expert in any of this technology by any stretch of the imagination, but what I read about small modular reactors seems very encouraging. And I think particularly it may offer a route for nuclear energy in a genuinely market-driven, private sector financed way, in a way that the traditional massive nuclear reactors have tended not to be. Governments have tended to have to be involved, or at least they felt that they have to be involved in delivering those kind of projects. If it was on a smaller scale, if the associated risks were therefore lower, there's a possibility, I think, that small modular nuclear reactors, could be part of a free market energy mix. And I think it's always important, actually, to just stress that particular point, that yes, we may start from a position where market forces and price signals really just don't operate in energy very much at all. And so it's impossible for there to be any kind of discovery process where different competing ideas are tried and fail, and you work out through a market process, what the best form of energy is for particular uses or for particular localities. But ultimately, that is what we would want for energy. We don't want to be in a situation where the government has to pick, well, we're all about renewables this year, or actually, no, we're all about nuclear now because we changed our mind. Partly it's silly to pick. The chances are you're going to be wrong, particularly when these things have a long lead time. By the time you've gone through all the planning processes and stuff, even if you happen to make the right decision in the first place, it might turn out to have been the wrong decision many years down the line. And of course, that's the same for any business, for any investment to a degree. You don't know that your bets are going to pay off. But it's unusual in the private sector for everyone to bet the same way at once. Whereas for the public sector, that is sort of the classic modus operandi. And so I know, I remember when Kwasi Kwarteng, previously and subsequently an avowed free marketeer, became energy secretary for a while. And I think there was some famous comment where he said, well, everyone's a free marketeer until they become energy secretary. And I think that has tended, unfortunately, to be the attitude of politicians towards the energy sector. And I recognize how very far away from any kind of functioning free market we are in energy at the moment. But I do think it's important to remember that that is where we should be trying to get back to. And it's the classic thing. There's a tendency to say, well, this area of policy, or just of life, is so extraordinarily complex, we need the government to be involved. That completely flips the correct logic on its head. The more complexity you have, the more you need markets, the more you need price signals, the more you need that discovery process to achieve the optimal outcomes. And so I'd like to see us, yes, deregulating nuclear. From a sort of tech nerd perspective, I love the idea of nuclear power and small modular reactors and everything. But it's important we don't get so excited about that we lose sight of the kind of underlying economics of this question at the same time.
Yeah, I remember on the last podcast I said that in a way the third runway at Heathrow is a microcosm of everything that's going wrong in the country economically, in the sense that you had up to a point a fantastic success story, high growth in passenger numbers, and then it just hits a wall and you need to expand the capacity, nothing happens. You could, I guess, argue nuclear power. But it's the same story. It's also it's just as much a microcosm of what's going wrong in the sense that I mean, this country was for a long time a world leader in nuclear energy, both on the research side and then in the actual implementation, and it then just hit a wall at some point. So no new nuclear power stations for 30 years, I think it is now, and going back to another theme from the last podcast, it's not even that we have an ideological opponent that we can clearly point to in that regard. It's not that the mood is militantly anti-nuclear energy and that is the reason. So, I mean, policy-wise, Britain is not the worst in the world. The German example is of course, far more extreme, where they just shut it down completely. But there, at least, you could say, if we were doing the podcast about their situation, we could say, well, at least they have, there's an ideological enemy that they can, that a free marketeer there could identify. There it's just the environmentalist movement grew out of the anti-nuclear movement, and it's just completely ingrained in their psyche. It's something, it's their founding myth, something that they absolutely cannot abandon, even if they try it, and even if they try to, if you try to argue on their own terms and saying, well, but you care so much about climate change and nuclear energy is kind of, low carbon. But it doesn't work that way when you're dealing with political founding myths. That's not really what happened here. So the Green Movement was in that regard not as influential here. They weren't able to say we would just shut down the nuclear energy. It's just that it got steadily more and more expensive and bureaucratic, and now we have these cost differences. You mentioned South Korea. I guess they are probably the best in class, but we don't even have to identify the best, just some average performer where doing basic stuff is just far more expensive here. And that's why for some of the nuclear projects, they took designs that were developed in Finland and France, so probably not likely regulated, probably not something that where you can have an entrepreneur just doing what they feel like doing, but pretty high regulatory standards. But it's still not good enough. There has to be extra bells and whistles here, and that's just what happened. That you just progressively drive a technology out of the market by adding more bureaucracy to it. And yes, ideally, so I've never described myself as pro-nuclear. I'm just technology neutral. But it is just the case that if we had a technology neutral scenario, I suspect nuclear would be a bigger part of the mix than it is now.
Yeah, I mean, something really interesting has happened with nuclear over the years, I think, in that most technologies, as they develop and as they advance, they become more efficient. So you get more output for the input for the price, effectively, right? And that hasn't happened with nuclear. It did happen, I think, in the early days, that you were able to produce a lot more energy for a certain cost as the technology developed. And then that stopped, and then it went into reverse. And I think a lot of people attribute this to the principle of ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. I've seen it done as ALARP as well, as low as reasonably possible. And that is basically referring to radiation, that radiation should be as low as it possibly can be at any given level of technology. So I think what potentially happened is once that regulatory stricture came in, technological improvements no longer led to greater efficiency. They were all recycled into greater safety. And of course, safety, I mean, who's against safety, especially when you're talking about something like nuclear energy. But the truth is, even at the beginning, nuclear energy was extraordinarily safe compared to a lot of other forms of energy. I mean, coal was famously sort of wrought death and destruction on a massive scale because mining it was so dangerous and such a dirty fuel and everything. So we kind of got this wrong impression, I guess, because of the nuclear bomb, and I mean, obviously Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, some of these famous accidents that have happened. But I think the reaction over the years has been the scale has been wrong. And we've become too risk averse and too safetyist. And I do wonder if there is a kind of ideology inherent in that which shoots across the entire regulatory state. That as we've developed and as our societies have got older, we have lost our appetite for risk, or we've lost our sense of the scale of relative risks. And we used to talk a lot about, European EU regulation being based on the precautionary principle and the fact that it hinders technological development and things like GM crops and so on, and there were costs associated with that. I think in a way that is true. We've lost the appetite for risk or the tolerance for risk, and we've elevated safety. Even though safety seems like a very worthy goal, if you take it to an extreme, it can actually be quite destructive. The outcomes, the consequences can be perverse. It seems to me that that's what's happened with nuclear. And again, I say without being an expert in the technology or its history or anything, it seems quite plausible to me, although I can't make this claim confidently, that had nuclear been regulated differently, it may have become a much more market viable technology a lot sooner. We can't know this. And I think that when people say, but your free market, why are you talking in favor of nuclear? It always requires massive subsidies and so on. I think you have to hold your hand up and say, well, yeah, it does seem to at the moment, but whose fault is that? Is that because of the way we've regulated, we've made it impossible to function as part of a proper energy market, or is it something that's inherent in the technology and the risks associated with it? This is why you need markets and you need a discovery process to work out the answers to those questions. My instinct, like Kristian's, and it's probably fairly obvious at this point, is that nuclear probably would be a much stronger part of the mix in a free market with appropriate levels of regulation. But that's something we'd like to find out.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The safety aspect is, I think, Kristian, to your point, yes, there is no sort of, or I guess there's in part an ideological opposition to nuclear, but it's really come out of this vast regulatory regime that we've put in place. But I think that is partly because, not necessarily an ideology, but the general fear of nuclear is just vast and completely outstripped compared to how safe it actually is. Fewer people die because of nuclear energy than have died because of hydropower and wind power.
Right.
When you put it in those terms, it's quite stark. But when you compare it to the connotations that nuclear has in war, with the nuclear bomb and Trident and all of that, on that side of things, and then these sort of very talismanic, awful things that happen in Chernobyl, etc., people get much more. I was talking to my own family who was saying they were very anti-nuclear back in the day because it was largely just associated with all these other things rather than looking at it. So I guess the job of the government, of us, of anybody else who wants to make the case for liberalising and for taking a more pragmatic approach to safety regulations is to point out that actually it is very safe. I think I've seen online something going around, some organisation has put into a can of, like a small sort of can of Coke size can, saying your entire life was powered by nuclear, the fuel would fit into this can. So it's trying to sort of push back against the general perception that nuclear is both nuclear is going to end up in the way it's portrayed in The Simpsons, where you end up with the artificial and everything.
But sometimes I do wonder whether, so when militant opponents of nuclear energy talk about safety risks, I think that is often just a rationalization. So it's really emotionally uncomfortable. Maybe they think of The Simpsons, or maybe they think still of the Chernobyl and mix it up with nuclear energy with nuclear weapons. And there's all these psychological combinations going on. But so you often wonder, say even in places where they are successful. I mentioned the German example where they did shut down the entire nuclear energy industry. But a lot of these people, some of them live, say, near the Swiss border, where there are several nuclear power plants. So they don't have a problem with that. Because they're there, it just feels okay that's something we can't influence. But if you genuinely thought that there was going to be some Chernobyl equivalent, well, if that happened in Switzerland, it's not that the radiation isn't going to stop at the border. So you would move to Alaska or somewhere if it was a genuine fear. I think it's mostly a moral impulse, splitting atoms. That's playing God. We shouldn't do that. That's somehow morally dubious. And then you try to rationalize it by talking about safety incidents.
Yeah, that's right. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thank you for joining us on this week's version of the IEA podcast. If you want more from us, subscribe to us on Substack. That's insider.iea.org.uk. And until next time, thank you very much.